Let me take you back to where it all began. I moved into Oakwood Estates 3 years ago after saving every penny I could from my job as a software engineer. It was not the biggest house on the block, but it was mine. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet streets lined with maple trees, well-kept lawns, and a sense of community that felt genuine. At least that is what the realtor promised. My property sits at the end of a cul-de-sac, backing up to a small wooded area that provided the privacy I had always wanted. The backyard stretches about half an acre with a gentle slope toward the tree line. I spent the first summer landscaping it myself, planting flower beds near the patio, adding bird feeders along the fence, and creating a small vegetable garden in the corner. This was going to be my sanctuary away from computer screens and deadlines. The first few months were peaceful. I would wake up early, have coffee on my back deck, and listen to birds chirping in the distance. The neighborhood had an HOA, of course. There were monthly newsletters about community standards and occasional reminders about trash cans and holiday decorations. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that prepared me for what was coming. It started on a Sunday morning in April. I was inside working when I heard the distant rumble of an engine, not a car or a lawnmower, something smaller, more aggressive. The sound faded quickly, and I thought nothing of it. Perhaps someone in the neighborhood had purchased an ATV for weekend fun. It was not my business, and I returned to my work. 3 days later, I heard it again. This time, I glanced out my office window just in time to see a flash of red disappear into the trees at the back corner of my property. I frowned. That was odd. There were no trails back there, at least none that I knew of. I walked outside after finishing my work, but found only tire tracks cutting across my lawn, disappearing into the wooded area. Probably neighborhood kids, I told myself, trying to be reasonable. They must not realize they are crossing private property. I decided to let it go. Everyone makes mistakes, and there was no real damage done. But it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Soon it became a daily occurrence, always the same time, always the same path across the back corner of my yard. The tracks were getting deeper, killing the grass and leaving ugly ruts in the previously smooth lawn. This was no accident. This was a routine. I decided to catch the mysterious rider in the act. One afternoon, I positioned myself near my back fence with a book, pretending to read while actually waiting. Right on schedule, I heard the familiar engine growl. I looked up to see a red ATV burst from the tree line and cut across my property without hesitation. The driver was not some teenager out for a joyride. It was a woman, probably in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, enormous designer sunglasses, and a tennis outfit that looked like it had never seen an actual tennis court. The most disturbing part was her expression. As she passed by and noticed me watching, her lips curled into what I can only describe as a smug, satisfied smirk. Our eyes met for just a moment before she accelerated, deliberately tearing up more grass as she disappeared back into the trees. That split-second interaction sent a chill down my spine. This was not a misunderstanding. She knew exactly whose property she was crossing. She knew I was watching, and she did not care. That night I could not sleep. Something about her demeanor bothered me deeply. It was not just the trespassing, it was the arrogance, the entitlement in that smirk. Like she was daring me to say something, like my property lines meant nothing to her. I did not know her name yet. I did not know what I had done to deserve this treatment. But I knew one thing for certain: this was intentional. And something in my gut told me this was only the beginning of what would become the strangest battle of my suburban life. The next morning, I decided to find out who my unwelcome visitor was. I walked down the street to my neighbor Mike's house. Mike had lived in Oakwood Estates for nearly 15 years and knew everyone. If anyone could identify my trespasser, it would be him. "Oh, that would be Janet Wilkins," Mike said, lowering his voice as if saying her name too loudly might summon her. "She lives in the big colonial on Maple Drive, the one with the white columns and 3-car garage." I waited for more information, but Mike seemed hesitant. Finally, he sighed and leaned closer. "Between you and me, everyone calls her Karen behind her back. She is the president of the HOA board, has been for 6 years running." This information made my stomach sink. The woman repeatedly trespassing on my property was not just any neighbor. She was essentially in charge of the community. She is difficult, Mike continued, choosing his words carefully. Very particular about how she thinks the neighborhood should be run. You must have done something that caught her attention. But I had not done anything. I kept to myself, maintained my property, and followed all the HOA guidelines. I thanked Mike and headed home, deciding the direct approach was best. I would simply talk to her, woman to woman. That afternoon, I spotted Janet, or Karen, as I could not help but think of her now, walking her small, overly groomed dog down the street. She wore an expensive-looking tracksuit and the same oversized sunglasses from her ATV ride. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching with what I hoped was a friendly smile. "Janet Wright, I am Alex from Pine Court. I was hopping to talk to you about something." She looked me up and down as if assessing whether I was worth her time. Her dog, a tiny white poodle with a rhinestone collar, yapped aggressively at my ankles. "Yes," she said, not bothering to quiet her dog or return my smile. "I noticed someone riding an ATV through the back corner of my property recently. I believe it might be you, and I wanted to discuss it." Janet's expression did not change. "That path is a community right-of-way," she stated matter-of-factly. "It has been used by residents for years." I frowned. A right-of-way. That was not mentioned in any of my property documents. "Well, it should have been," she replied dismissively. "That trail connects the north and south sides of the neighborhood. Everyone uses it." "But it crosses through private property, my property," I insisted, trying to keep my voice level. Janet removed her sunglasses, revealing cold blue eyes. "Listen, new resident. Some things in this neighborhood work a certain way because that is how they have always worked. The path stays open. End of discussion." With that, she tugged her dog's leash and walked away, leaving me standing there, dumbfounded by her audacity. That evening, I pulled out my property deed and all the documents from my home purchase. I read through every page, every footnote. There was no mention of any easement, right-of-way, or community path on my land. The property lines were clear. Everything within those boundaries belonged exclusively to me. Over the next few days, I spoke with other neighbors, casually bringing up Janet in conversation. Their reactions told me everything. Eyes would dart away. Voices would lower. One woman whispered about how Janet had forced the previous HOA treasurer to resign after he questioned her use of community funds. Another mentioned receiving daily fines when she dared to paint her door a shade of blue Janet did not approve of. Meanwhile, the ATV rides continued. If anything, they became more frequent, more deliberate. Janet would now slow down when passing my home, making sure I saw her. The engine would mysteriously get louder near my property line. And always that smirk, a clear message that she considered herself untouchable. This was not just about a path anymore. This was about power. And Janet had made it clear she had no intention of relinquishing even an inch of it. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I prefer logic, reason, and civil discussion. But after 2 weeks of Janet's daily trespassing, I decided more direct action was necessary. One Saturday morning, I placed a row of small orange flags along my property line, marking the boundary clearly. I added a few traffic cones at the point where the ATV trail crossed into my yard. Nothing aggressive, just visible markers that said private property. They lasted exactly 4 hours. That afternoon, right on schedule, I heard the roar of the ATV engine. I rushed to my back window just in time to see Janet deliberately swerve toward my markers. She ran over the flags, knocking them flat. The cones went flying in different directions as she gunned the engine. She actually laughed as she did it. I could see her shoulders shaking even from a distance. The next day, I tried a different approach. I stood in my backyard with my phone camera ready when I heard her coming. As she crossed onto my property, I began recording, making sure to capture a clear view of her face and the property boundary she was violating. Janet spotted me filming immediately. Instead of avoiding the camera, she accelerated, driving dangerously close to where I stood. As she passed, she lifted one hand from the handlebars and extended her middle finger directly at me. The gesture was so unexpected, so childish from a woman her age that I almost laughed. Almost, until I noticed how close she had come to hitting me. 3 days later, I received my first official warning letter from the HOA. It cited unauthorized structures in the backyard visible from community spaces. The structures in question, my boundary flags and cones. The letter demanded their immediate removal, or I would face a daily fine of $50. I called the number listed at the bottom of the letter and was connected to the HOA secretary, a nervous-sounding man named Robert. "I am trying to understand this warning," I explained calmly. "The items in question are on my property and are there because someone keeps trespassing on my land." Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes, well, the board voted that the items violate the aesthetic standards of the community." "The entire board voted on my traffic cones?" I asked incredulously. Another throat clearing. "The board typically follows President Wilkins' recommendations without much debate." Of course they did. Later that week, another neighbor confirmed what I suspected. Janet controlled the board completely. 2 members were her close friends, and the others were too intimidated to challenge her. She had created a perfect system of neighborhood control. The situation took a frightening turn one evening when I was in my backyard with my dog, Cooper. He was on his leash, sniffing around the garden as I watered my plants. The familiar roar of Janet's ATV grew louder, and suddenly she burst through the tree line, driving faster than usual. Cooper, startled by the noise, barked and jumped. Janet swerved deliberately toward us, missing Cooper by mere inches. My heart nearly stopped. If he had moved even slightly in her direction, she would have hit him. I stormed inside, hands shaking with anger, and marked the date of the next HOA meeting on my calendar. This had gone beyond petty harassment. It was time to confront her publicly. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About 30 residents attended, most looking bored or resigned. Janet sat at the front table with the other board members, a stack of papers in front of her and that same smug expression on her face. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I stood and calmly described the ATV situation, explaining that my property was being repeatedly violated. "I have asked politely for this to stop," I concluded. "I am requesting that the board address this trespassing issue." Before anyone else could speak, Janet leaned forward into her microphone. "This is ridiculous," she announced. "Alex moved here recently and has been nothing but difficult. The path in question has been used by residents for decades. Furthermore, Alex has been harassing me by filming me and placing hazardous obstacles on community land." Several board members nodded in agreement. I tried to respond, but Janet kept talking over me, her voice growing louder. "Perhaps if you read your HOA guidelines more carefully," she continued, "you would understand that community cohesion is our priority, not personal vendettas." I left that meeting humiliated and angry, but also determined. If Janet wanted to play dirty, I would need to fight smarter, much smarter. That night, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to a professional land surveyor named Marcus. The second was to Sarah Chen, a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. Both agreed to help me, and both confirmed what I already knew: emotion would not win this battle. Evidence would. Marcus arrived the following Tuesday with his equipment. He spent hours measuring, marking, and documenting every inch of my property line. His conclusion was definitive. My deed was correct, my property lines were clear, and there was absolutely no easement or right-of-way granted across my land. "Whoever told you there was a community path here was mistaken," Marcus said diplomatically. I thanked him for his professionalism, even though we both knew mistaken was not the right word for Janet's deliberate lies. My meeting with Sarah was equally illuminating. After reviewing my documents and the survey results, she laid out a clear strategy. "Do not engage directly anymore," she advised. "Document everything: date, time, photographs if possible. We need to establish a pattern of willful trespassing and harassment." "What about the HOA warnings?" I asked, showing her the letters I had received. Sarah's expression hardened. "This is a clear abuse of HOA authority. Keep those letters. We may need them later to demonstrate retaliation." I followed Sarah's advice to the letter. That weekend, I purchased 3 high-quality trail cameras designed for wildlife photography. They were small, weatherproof, and equipped with motion sensors. I mounted them discreetly in trees overlooking the areas where Janet typically rode her ATV. They would activate automatically when motion was detected, capturing date-stamped video evidence. Within a week, the cameras had recorded Janet trespassing across my property 8 separate times. The footage was crystal clear, her face easily identifiable, the property boundaries obvious thanks to Marcus's survey markers. In several videos, she could be seen deliberately riding over those markers, sometimes stopping to look directly at my house before continuing on her way. But the cameras captured something else, something unexpected. One morning, they recorded Janet leading 2 men in work uniforms through my backyard. They were measuring and discussing something, pointing toward the trees where her ATV path continued. I found this strange enough to investigate further. I spent an evening reviewing old HOA meeting minutes, which were archived on the neighborhood website. 3 months before I moved in, the board had approved a significant expenditure for community path improvements. The contractor was paid to pave a pathway that ran from the back of Maple Drive, where Janet lived, toward the wooded area. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. Janet had used HOA funds to pave a convenient shortcut from her house to the main road on the other side of the neighborhood. But to make the connection work, she needed to cut across what would become my property. She had essentially used community money to create a private path for her own convenience. Armed with this information, I expanded my investigation. I requested financial records from the HOA, citing my rights as a member. Most were denied, but enough came through to establish a pattern. Janet had been using HOA funds for projects that primarily benefited her property or her friends' properties for years. I compiled everything: the survey results, the trail cam footage, the financial records, the HOA warning letters, and my own detailed journal of every incident. I organized it all chronologically, creating a comprehensive file that told the complete story of Janet's abuse of power. I did not confront her again. I did not place any more flags or cones. I simply watched, documented, and prepared. To anyone observing, it might have seemed like I had given up. Janet certainly thought so. Her ATV rides became even more frequent, more brazenly intrusive. She had no idea what was coming. On a crisp Monday morning, Janet received an official cease and desist letter from Sarah Chen's law office. The letter was comprehensive, citing the property survey, documenting the repeated trespassing incidents, and demanding an immediate end to all unauthorized entry onto my property. It also referenced the misuse of HOA funds for the creation of the unauthorized path and hinted at potential legal action if the trespassing continued. I was working from home when I heard the pounding on my front door. Through the peephole, I could see Janet standing on my porch, her face flushed with anger, the cease and desist letter clutched in her hand. I opened the door but remained behind the screen. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving the letter in my face. Her voice was so loud that neighbors across the street stopped to stare. "The letter explains everything," I replied calmly. "You have been trespassing on my property despite repeated requests to stop." "That path has been there for years," she shouted. "You have no right to block community access." "According to the county records and professional survey, I have every right. There is no easement, no right of way, and no community access granted across my property." Janet's face contorted with rage. "Do you know who I am in this community? Do you have any idea what I can make happen to you?" "Are you threatening me?" I asked, making sure my voice remained steady. "Because that would be unfortunate, especially with witnesses present." I nodded toward the neighbors who had stopped to observe the confrontation. Janet followed my gaze, suddenly aware of her audience. She stepped back, straightening her posture. "This is not over," she hissed, turning on her heel and storming down my walkway. It should have been over, but of course it was not. That very night, my trail cameras captured Janet on her ATV, riding across my property just as she always had. This time, she stopped in the middle of my yard, looked directly at the house, and slowly, deliberately made an obscene gesture before continuing on her way. I forwarded the new footage to Sarah immediately. By morning, she had filed an official trespassing complaint with local law enforcement, and sent a second letter warning of imminent legal action, including potential financial damages. Janet's response was to escalate further. The next edition of the HOA newsletter included a front-page article about problem residents who refuse to respect community traditions and threaten legal action instead of working together. Though it did not name me specifically, everyone knew who it referred to. Then came the retaliatory HOA violations. In a single week, I received notices about my grass being a quarter-inch too tall, my mailbox being an unapproved shade of black, and my garbage cans being visible from the street for 30 minutes too long. Each violation carried a fine, and each fine increased with every day of noncompliance. But Janet's most dramatic move came 3 days after the trespassing complaint was filed. I was in my backyard, photographing the damage from her ATV tracks for documentation, when I heard the familiar engine roar. Instead of cutting across the corner as usual, Janet drove her ATV directly toward the center of my yard where I was standing. She stopped about 20 feet away. "You think you can push me out?" she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I built this neighborhood, I made it what it is. Who do you think you are?" Several neighbors had come out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. Janet did not seem to notice or care. "You are going to drop these ridiculous complaints," she continued, pointing a finger at me. "Or I will make your life in this community impossible. No one crosses me. No one." I remained silent, aware of the growing audience and the fact that my security camera was capturing everything. Janet revved her engine threateningly before spinning her ATV around, tearing up more of my lawn in the process and speeding away. As I watched her go, I realized something had changed. Janet was no longer calculating and controlled. She was unraveling, making mistakes, showing her true nature in public, and people were finally seeing it. The neighborhood whispers were growing louder. The tide was turning, and it was time to make my final move. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. This time I arrived early, accompanied by Sarah. We took seats near the front, a folder of evidence placed neatly on my lap. Other residents filed in, many nodding to me with tentative smiles. Something had shifted in the community. Janet's public outburst had cracked her carefully cultivated facade. Janet arrived last, making a point to slam the community center door as she entered. She took her place at the head table, shuffling papers aggressively and avoiding eye contact with anyone. The other board members looked uncomfortable, exchanging nervous glances. The meeting proceeded through standard business, budget updates, landscaping plans, community events. When they finally reached resident concerns, I raised my hand immediately. Janet tried to skip over me, but another board member quietly insisted that I be recognized. I stood and walked to the front of the room, Sarah beside me. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I would like to address an ongoing issue that affects not just me, but potentially every homeowner in this community." Janet interrupted immediately. "If this is about the supposed trespassing again." "Madam President," Sarah interjected smoothly, "my client has the floor. Board procedures require that you allow residents their allotted time to speak." Janet fell silent, though her expression promised retribution. I connected my laptop to the projector that had been used earlier for budget presentations. For the past several months, I have experienced repeated trespassing on my property by an individual using an ATV. Despite multiple polite requests to stop, the behavior continued. I would like to share some documentation with the community. The first image appeared on screen, a clear survey map of my property with boundaries highlighted. This is the official survey of my land. As you can see, there are no easements or rights of way granted across it. I clicked to the next slide, a still image from one of my trail cameras showing Janet clearly riding across my property. This is one of over 30 documented instances of trespassing since I moved in. Janet stood up. "This is ridiculous, that path has been." "Please let me finish," I said firmly. "I have documentation that this community path was actually created using HOA funds shortly before I purchased my home. Specifically, HOA money was used to pave a section that creates a convenient shortcut from Maple Drive to the main road. I played a short video compilation showing Janet repeatedly crossing my property, deliberately damaging my boundary markers, and finally her public outburst days earlier. The room was completely silent as her voice echoed from the speakers. "I built this neighborhood. No one crosses me." When the video ended, I turned to face the residents. I believe this represents a serious misuse of HOA authority and funds for personal benefit. It also demonstrates a pattern of harassment when I attempted to protect my legal property rights. I expected Janet to explode, but instead, something surprising happened. A woman in the back stood up. "Janet has been using HOA violation notices to punish anyone who disagrees with her for years," she said. "She threatened to fine me daily when I questioned the pool renovation costs." Another resident stood. "She had my children's basketball hoop removed while we were on vacation, claiming it violated guidelines that did not exist." Suddenly, the dam broke. One by one, residents began sharing their stories, accounts of intimidation, selective enforcement, and retaliation. Janet tried repeatedly to restore order, banging a gavel and shouting for silence, but no one was listening to her anymore. The meeting ended with an unprecedented motion from one of the board members, a vote of no confidence in the HOA president. When the hands went up, Janet found herself alone. Even her loyal board members, sensing the shift in power, voted against her. She did not say a word as she gathered her things and walked out. The expression on her face was no longer smug. It was the look of someone who finally understood that actions have consequences. Change did not happen overnight, but it came steadily in the weeks following that dramatic HOA meeting. An interim board was established, led by Mike, my neighbor who had first warned me about Janet. Their first act was to conduct a thorough audit of HOA finances and practices. The audit revealed what many had suspected: years of funds diverted to projects that primarily benefited Janet and her allies. The paved path behind her house was just one example among many. The board voted unanimously to require Janet to reimburse the HOA for the improperly allocated funds. They also agreed to cover my legal expenses as compensation for the harassment I had endured. Janet fought back at first, threatening lawsuits and rallying her few remaining supporters. But as more financial irregularities came to light, her position became untenable. 2 months after the meeting, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of her colonial with the white columns. She listed the house with a realtor from another town, avoiding all contact with former neighbors. The day she moved out was remarkably quiet. No goodbye party, no final HOA appearance. A moving company came early in the morning and was gone by afternoon. Janet drove away without looking back, her red ATV loaded onto a trailer behind her SUV. With Janet gone, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA board established clear, fair guidelines and created a transparent process for handling violations and resident concerns. Meetings became collaborative rather than confrontational. People actually volunteered to serve on committees. As for me, I finally turned my attention to restoring my property. The ATV path had left deep ruts and killed large patches of grass in my backyard. I spent weekends replanting and landscaping, gradually erasing the scars Janet had left behind. Where the path had cut through my yard, I planted a row of flowering cherry trees that would eventually grow to provide beauty and privacy. One Saturday, while I was working in the yard, Mike stopped by with a housewarming gift. Belatedly, he joked. "Never got around to properly welcoming you to the neighborhood," he said, handing me a plant. "It is a peace lily, seemed appropriate." I thanked him and invited him to stay for coffee. As we sat on my back patio, overlooking the half-finished landscaping project, he shook his head in amazement. "You know, people tried to stand up to Janet for years," he said. "But everyone eventually gave up. You were different, you fought smart instead of loud." "I just wanted to be left alone," I replied honestly, "to enjoy my home in peace." "That is what everyone wants," Mike agreed. "And now we all can, thanks to you." The HOA held an election for permanent board positions in the fall. Several neighbors encouraged me to run for president, but I declined. I had no interest in community politics. I had only wanted what was rightfully mine. Instead, I volunteered to serve on the landscaping committee, helping to design communal spaces that everyone could enjoy. Gradually, my mornings returned to what I had originally envisioned when I bought the house. Coffee on the back deck, birds singing in the trees, the peaceful rustle of leaves in the breeze. No engine noise, no confrontations, no anxiety about what new harassment each day might bring. Sometimes new residents would ask about the Janet stories they had heard. The tales had taken on an almost mythical quality, the HOA president who ruled through fear until one homeowner stood up to her. I always downplayed my role, emphasizing instead how the entire community had eventually come together. What I learned from the experience was not about victory or revenge. It was about the importance of standing firm when you know you are right, not with anger or matching bad behavior, but with evidence, patience, and proper channels. It would have been easy to respond to Janet's provocations with similar tactics. The harder path was maintaining composure and trusting that truth would eventually prevail. A year after Janet moved away, my cherry trees bloomed for the first time, creating a stunning line of pink and white blossoms exactly where her ATV had once trespassed. Every spring since, they have returned, more beautiful than the year before. They stand as a living reminder that with enough care and patience, even the deepest scars can be transformed into something beautiful. After all, true peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is the presence of justice, respect, and harmony. And that is something worth fighting for, the right way.